Heath was determined to succeed where Wilson failed and introduced new laws to control the union. In a foretaste of what was to come, the workers took to the streets in protest.
The 5,000 men who marched in Birmingham today came mainly from the Austin Morris factory at Longridge.
In a way, Ted was ahead of his time. We were trying to do things the country was not yet ready for. It's an extraordinary thing about the British. We have to go through a lot of misery before we actually decide what we want to do.
For the political satirists at Private Eye, the apparently humourless Heath was an easy target. They cast him as the managing director of an embattled company called Heathco Limited.
Heathco was a sort of run-down company operating in the suburbs of London, and it had all gone pear-shaped. And this man was trying to keep it going, but he was continually being frustrated by the workers.
To all employees, I would like to address a few words to all of you about our new code of industrial behaviour at Heathco's. And let me say here and now that I am fully conversant with the fact that some of you may find these new regulations a bitter pill to swallow.
The unions would be one common thread that bound Heath and Wilson. The second was the irreversible change in Britain's identity. Britain had ceased to be an imperial world power. For Heath, its new role had to be the one he'd so long dreamed of, at the heart of a unified Europe. France's General de Gaulle had first rebuffed Harold Macmillan in 1963, then Harold Wilson in 1967. But there was now a new French president, Georges Pompidou, and Heath made it his business to make Pompidou open the door. On the 22nd of January 1972, Heath took Britain into Europe.
That was a personal achievement. Whether you think that it is right for us to be in Europe or not, I think he has to be credited with that achievement.
Certainly, Ted Heath felt a sense of triumph, of personal triumph. To have one where Wilson had failed did add a certain extra savour to the achievement.
Wilson was profoundly irritated that Heath had succeeded where he'd missed out. Though Heath's terms of entry were much the same as Wilson would have accepted, he now used them to perform a political somersault.
But the terms Mr. Heath accepted mean that Britain has to accept terms and burdens and sacrifices which no other members of the Six would ever have accepted for themselves.
Our hopes have been fulfilled. We have succeeded. And there is nothing which infuriates the prophets and apostles of gloom and defeat more than success.
Heath, understandably, took a rather low view of this kind of volte-face that Wilson had committed. Basically, he got the party to stand on its head and waggle its legs in the air and pretend it had never stood upright in favour of Europe at all, but it had.
It's Heath who gets it through. And so Wilson manages to rain on even that parade. And tellingly, he won't even go and sort of mark the event in Brussels or in London or whatever. He goes off to watch a football match instead, when Britain exceeds the European community.
Heath's great achievement came amid gathering economic gloom. 2 days before he signed the treaty, unemployment in Britain, which had quietly been creeping up since the 1960s, finally reached 1 million.
When unemployment hit 1 million, the House of Commons had to be suspended. There was so much opposition and so much noise. The very fact that unemployment went to 3 million or more under Margaret Thatcher, and very nearly as high again under Labour a few years later, didn't alter the fact that for unemployment to reach 1 million was regarded as being a terrible political blunder.
Heath was deeply troubled. Unemployment went against everything he believed in. It marked the beginning of a terrible few weeks.
But tell me, where do the children play?
On the 30th of January 1972, 13 men were shot dead on the streets of Derry by the British Army. Bloody Sunday. Then the miners walked out on strike, the first national miners' strike since 1926. The Crucible was a coke depot on the outskirts of Birmingham, Saltley, where the miners were using flying pickets to block lorries. Heath knew this was where the battle would be won or lost. The climax came during a cabinet meeting on the 10th of February.
Ted asked Reggie Maudling, who was Home Secretary at the time, whether he could give us any information on it. And Maudling said that he'd just been talking to the Chief Constable of Birmingham, who had said that under all circumstances he was going to keep the gasworks open. And an hour later a message came in from Reggie Maudling to say that the Chief Constable had just rung up to say that the pressure had become too great. He'd closed the gates and no lorries were getting in or out, and therefore the unions had won.
Heath had lost the first big battle of wills with the union. Harold Wilson sniffed his opportunity. He'd kept a low profile since his election defeat. But now it was time to take on his adversary once again.
Mr. Heath was going to deal with strikes. He was going to end them once for all. In fact, we've lost far more man days through disputes under this government than in 20 months than in the whole 5 years, 8 months of the Labour government.
It was only halfway through Heath's administration, when things began to go badly wrong, that Wilson pricked up his ears and said, back into the battle.
1 million unemployed had seriously rattled Heath. He'd been elected on a promise to make British industry competitive and let lame ducks go to the wall. But in 1972, he went into abrupt reverse and poured in government money to rescue failing businesses, most notably Upper Clyde shipbuilders in Glasgow.
He took the view that unemployment was such an evil thing to happen that he decided that he had to do what was then known as a U-turn. Of course, looking back at it, I think he was wrong, because the welfare state had intervened, and unemployment, though awful, didn't have the same sort of horrors that it had before the Second World War.
Heath's U-turn astonished the nation, and it was only the beginning. He now decided that government, far from letting the free market rule, should run the economy itself in collaboration with business and the unions. It sounded just like Harold Wilson.
They're both really social democrats. They both believe in a large state. They both believe in quite high taxation. They both hold various positions at various times. They almost deliberately hold the opposite positions of the one the other's holding, and then as soon as they're elected, they switch back.
Wilson once told me, he said, I'm quite surprised that Ted Heath ever became a Tory. Famously, when Ted Heath turned the Tory party completely in a terrific U-turn, he once criticised Ted Heath with the jibe, he's just a socialist. And I don't think Heath liked that.
Do you know Britain's favourite game? It's called inflation.
Heath was battling rocketing inflation at home and complex global economic forces. In October 1973, oil prices soared after war broke out in the Middle East. Heath introduced government control of prices and incomes, pleading with the unions to work with him.
Mr. Buck of Briarfield, would you please put your question to the Prime Minister?
What is the purpose of discussing a policy on prices and incomes with the TUC when it is known that they could never be seen cooperating with the Tory government.
Well, of course, I wouldn't accept your final point that they could never be seen cooperating with the Tory government. In fact, we've been having these talks now over the past 15 months, and they've been extremely valuable.
But now, at Heath's moment of maximum weakness, the miners came back for more.
By the second time, it was not just money they were after. It was to overthrow the government.
The miners went on strike. Heath introduced a 3-day week and restrictions on energy to conserve coal stocks.
I was for about 10 minutes Secretary for Energy when there wasn't any. There was no, like, the 3-day week, and, everybody was miserable. It was a horrible time, and that one didn't see an end of it, and there couldn't be really an end of it until you settled the miners' strike.
It is the fall in coal production and delivery as a result of industrial action that makes today's severe measures essential. So we must all use less electricity. In terms of comfort, we shall have a harder Christmas than we have known since the war.
There's a deep feeling in the hearts of our people that they would like to get back to a spirit of conciliation, to unite the country, in place of all these confrontations which divided.
Once Heath began to go down, Wilson was on him like a ferret on a rabbit, and got his teeth firmly into the Prime Minister's throat.
At times, the 3-day week was pure tragicomedy.
Never had a better deal, have they?
One of the things was saunas. And so I asked my officials, I said, what can we do about this? Surely there don't need to be any saunas during all this evening. Well, they came back and said, well, Minister, there are 3 sorts of saunas. There are saunas in health clubs, and there are saunas in hotels, and there are dubious saunas. Well, I said, I think they can all be asked to be switched off, but I loved the expression dubious saunas. I knew exactly what they meant.
The government was writing the script for comedians without the need for any editors. It was a great time to be engaged in politics, a pretty awful time to live in Britain. That was the reality.
There were a number of silly things that happened, but they were very difficult days. They were days which no other government, I think, really has had to face.
Most of Heath's closest colleagues and advisers urged him to go for an early election to take the wind out of the miners' and Harold Wilson's sails.
It's all very well appealing to a Dunkirk spirit, but Dunkirk spirit lasts for days more than weeks. I only remember seeing Ted once by then and saying exactly that. And he was cross, not to put too fine a point on it.
Heath was determined to hang in and get a deal with the miners. At one point, he informally agreed a solution with the miners' leader Joe Gormley, which involved paying miners for washing time. Wilson sabotaged it.
Gormley, rather rashly, told Harold Wilson what he'd suggested. Harold Wilson promptly wrote a more or less open letter to Heath, suggesting it, putting it forward as being a solution, which of course meant that Heath, in turn, felt bound to turn it down. Gormley believed that Wilson had done this deliberately to scupper the negotiations, and that otherwise this could have been a solution.
The miners voted on Heath's final offer. He was desperate for them to accept it. They didn't.
I had to go and tell him the result of this ballot. I remember taking it up to Downing Street one morning, realizing the significance of it, and I remember him sitting in his chair and looking at the result and said, "What can I do now?" And I said to him that it wasn't my job to give him political advice. I think there's only one thing you can do, which is to have a general election.
On the 7th of February 1974, Heath finally called an election.
This time, the strife has got to stop. Only you can stop it. It's time for you to speak with your vote. It is time for you to say to the extremists, the militants, and to the plain and simple misguided, we've had enough.
Heath out! Heath out! Heath out!
Ted Heath started to try to make the election about, well, who runs the country? Is it the unions or is it the elected government?